John Garrett had always been a man of few words, but in the years after his wife Emily passed away, silence became his only companion. Standing alone at the fence of his ranch, watching the sun set behind the hills, Garrett felt an ache deep in his chest, one that had been there for the past 3 years. His eyes followed the fading light as it bathed the land in golden hues, but he didn't see the beauty of the moment. He saw only emptiness. The vibrant colors that once brought life to his world now felt cold and foreign, as if the land itself mourned with him. The loss of Emily had been more than just a heartbreak. It had felt like the end of everything that mattered. Their ranch had once been filled with laughter and the smell of fresh bread baking in the oven. It had been a home, a sanctuary for the two of them. Now, it was just a place where memories lingered like ghosts in the corners of every room. The wind that blew across the plains seemed to carry with it not only the chill of the season, but the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. He had lost her, and in the process, he had lost himself. Every evening, Garrett found himself standing in the same spot, waiting for the sun to disappear, as it always did, knowing that once it was gone, he would be left alone again with the darkness. The weight of his grief pressed down on him more with each passing year, yet he couldn't seem to move forward. He couldn't forget her. The wedding ring on his finger was the only thing that kept him tethered to the past. People in town told him to take it off. It was a symbol of something he couldn't change, they said, but he couldn't do it. Every time he thought about removing it, it felt like he was dishonoring her memory. How could he move on? How could he let go? His life had become a monotonous cycle: wake up, work the land, eat his meals alone, and go to bed with the empty space beside him, untouched. He didn't know how to live any differently. It had become easier to remain in the past, to keep his emotions buried beneath the layers of grief, than to face the prospect of living without her. But deep down, Garrett knew the truth. He couldn't keep living like this forever. He had built his own prison, and the walls were closing in, but he wasn't ready to break free. Not yet. Every night, he would find himself staring at the window, watching the light flicker from the lone lamp inside the cabin, and remember the nights when Emily had sat across from him at the table, her eyes bright with life, her laugh filling the room. It felt like just yesterday, but the pain was still as sharp as it had been on that first night when she was gone. He glanced over at the small wooden cross near the edge of the pasture, the place where Emily now rested. It stood tall against the wind and snow, a quiet monument to everything he had lost. The years had passed, but the grief had not. Every day, he saw that cross from the window of the house, reminding him of the life he once had, the life he had loved, and it seemed impossible to let go. The matchmaker's visit. It was the second week of November when Mrs. Henderson arrived at his doorstep again, as relentless as the wind that swept across the plains. She had tried this before, many times. But John Garrett was a stubborn man, and no amount of gentle coaxing had been able to move him. Mrs. Henderson, the town's most notorious matchmaker, was determined to change that. Her horse's hooves clicked against the dirt as she rode toward the ranch, Sarah in tow. Garrett recognized Sarah immediately as the young woman Mrs. Henderson had mentioned in passing just a few days ago. She was from St. Louis, new to the county, and Mrs. Henderson had made it her mission to match the young woman with Garrett. Sarah was young, polite, and beautiful in the way most women in the West were. Strong, capable, and able to withstand the harsh elements. But Sarah wasn't the woman Garrett needed. As Mrs. Henderson and Sarah dismounted, Garrett stood at the fence, watching them approach. He knew what was coming. It was the same every time. Mrs. Henderson's bright, eager smile, and her insistence that he needed a wife. He wasn't interested. He had made that clear, time and again. But there she was again, bringing another woman to his doorstep, as if the last 20 rejections didn't matter. "John," Mrs. Henderson said as she walked up to him. Her voice was firm, like she had a plan and wasn't going to let him ruin it. "This is Sarah. I think you'll find she's a perfect match for you. A fine cook, practical, and strong. She could help you with the ranch. Winter is coming, and I know you could use someone by your side." Garrett didn't look at Sarah. He didn't need to. He could already tell from her nervous hands and the forced smile on her face that she was trying to play a part. He wasn't interested in playing games anymore. His heart had been buried along with Emily's grave, and he had no intention of digging it up. "Thank you, but I'm fine," Garrett said flatly. He didn't need to explain himself. He didn't owe anyone an explanation. "I've told you before, Mrs. Henderson. I don't need a wife. I don't need anyone." Mrs. Henderson didn't back down. She stepped closer, her voice sharp and determined. "John, you can't keep living like this. A man needs a woman. You can't survive another winter alone. And Sarah, well, she's here for you. She's willing to work with you. You don't have to do this by yourself." Garrett's eyes narrowed. "I said no." Mrs. Henderson, though clearly frustrated, didn't give up. "You can't live this way forever, John. I've seen it before, men who bury themselves in grief. But you have to move forward. You have to live again. You can't keep hiding from the world." Her words were harsh, but they struck a chord. The truth was, Garrett had been hiding. Hiding from the pain, hiding from the future, hiding from anything that might make him feel again. He couldn't admit it to her, not out loud, but the loneliness gnawed at him more than he cared to admit. He stood in silence as Mrs. Henderson left, Sarah quietly following behind her. But as the sound of hooves faded into the distance, Garrett found himself standing still, staring out into the horizon. He wasn't ready to open up to anyone. He wasn't ready to move on. But the thought of another winter alone, of spending more nights staring into the darkness, made his chest tighten. Maybe Mrs. Henderson was right. Maybe he couldn't live like this forever. But how could he move forward when it felt like his heart had already been buried? The stubborn cowboy. The days that followed were filled with a quiet tension. Garrett had hoped that the visit from Mrs. Henderson would fade away like the others, but it lingered in his mind, gnawing at him. He had spent the last 3 years in a prison of his own making, too afraid to open up, too afraid to feel anything again. It was easier to live in the past, to keep his emotions buried, than to face the future. But the thought of another winter alone had started to wear on him. He couldn't shake the image of Clara Dawson from his mind, strong, independent, and undeniably real. She wasn't pretending to be something she wasn't. She wasn't asking for his love. She was just asking for a chance to survive. Garrett had heard the whispers in town. People talked about her past, about the fact that her husband had abandoned her, leaving her with nothing but debt and shame. But what struck Garrett the most wasn't her past, it was her resilience. Clara had taken the broken pieces of her life and turned them into something strong. She wasn't waiting for a handout. She wasn't waiting for a rescue. She was simply living, despite everything that had been thrown her way. As the days passed, Garrett began to realize that he couldn't keep living this way. He had buried himself in work, in the ranch, in the memories of Emily. But it wasn't enough anymore. He needed to move on. He needed to live again. But how? How could he open his heart when it felt like the world had already closed it? He didn't have the answers, but he knew one thing for sure: he didn't want to face another winter alone. He didn't want to be the man who had let grief rob him of everything. He didn't want to be the man who had buried his future for the sake of a past he couldn't change. It wasn't love he was looking for. It was survival. It was partnership. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to take the first step toward it. The trading post. Gossip. The trading post was busier than usual when Garrett arrived to stock up for the long winter ahead. He had always avoided the town as much as possible, preferring the solitude of his ranch, where the only voices he heard were his own thoughts and the occasional grunt of the animals. But today, he had no choice. The roads were about to close for the season, and he needed supplies to last through the harsh months ahead. As he stepped into the crowded store, the warmth of the building hit him, along with the sharp scent of tobacco and the rich aroma of fresh brewed coffee. The busy chatter of ranchers and farmers filled the air, the sound of boots scuffing the wooden floor blending with the low hum of conversation. Garrett went about his business in silence, filling his arms with flour, salt, canned goods, and other essentials. But he couldn't escape the whispers. It was impossible not to overhear the talk as he passed through the aisles. "She's moved into the old Mercer place," someone muttered, low enough for only a few to hear. Clara Dawson, they say. Divorcee. Her husband took everything, left her with nothing but shame. The words stung Garrett more than they should have. He had heard them before. Of course, Clara's story was no secret. The town had never been kind to women who had been abandoned. There was judgment, harsh and unforgiving, even if it wasn't spoken aloud. But Clara didn't seem to care about the gossip. She never did. She's living out there alone now, they say. Someone else continued, their voice thick with judgment. That land will break her. It always does. Garrett's mind wandered back to the last time he saw Clara. The way she worked alone, her back straight, her hands steady as she split wood. She hadn't asked anyone for help. She hadn't begged for pity. She had simply gone about her work, as if the weight of the world didn't matter. In that moment, Garrett saw something in her that he hadn't realized he'd been looking for. Strength. Real, unyielding strength. He grabbed a few more cans from the shelf, lost in thought, when the familiar voice of Mrs. Henderson broke through the noise. "You hear about Clara Dawson?" she asked, appearing at his side with that same determined look she always had when she was trying to push a new match. "She's taken up residence at the old Mercer place. Can you believe it? Alone, just like that. What kind of woman does that?" Garrett didn't respond immediately. He was too busy trying to ignore the fact that he was suddenly more curious about Clara than he'd been before. "Some women just don't know when to quit, Mrs. Henderson continued, oblivious to his growing discomfort. "She'll never last out there alone. A woman needs a man to help her. She needs stability, and she needs protection, especially in these parts." Garrett looked at her, his mind racing. He hadn't expected to feel the way he did about Clara. It wasn't pity, nor was it love. It was something else, something he couldn't quite put into words. But one thing was clear. Clara Dawson was different. "I'll be fine," Garrett said curtly, cutting off the conversation before it could go any further. "Got my work to do." Mrs. Henderson didn't seem to hear him. She had already moved on to another subject, but Garrett didn't care. He was already thinking about Clara, about her strength, her resilience, and how she seemed to be the only one who wasn't afraid of facing the world head-on. Clara Dawson's first encounter. It was a few days later when Garrett saw her again. This time, she wasn't standing at the edge of his fence. She wasn't waiting in the distance. Clara Dawson was standing at his barn, holding a broken axle. The weight of the moment hit Garrett harder than it should have. She wasn't just here for help. She was here because she needed something fixed, and she wasn't afraid to ask for it. "Morning," Garrett called out as he approached. Clara looked up, her eyes meeting his. "Morning," she replied, her voice low but steady. "Got a broken axle. Can you fix it?" Without waiting for a response, she handed it to him, and for a moment, Garrett found himself just standing there. She wasn't asking for anything more than his help. No emotional exchange, no pretense. She simply needed the axle repaired so she could get on with her work. Garrett nodded and motioned toward the forge. "I can fix it." Clara didn't ask for any more details. She didn't try to make small talk. She simply followed him, the two of them moving toward the forge in silence. As Garrett worked, he couldn't help but notice the way Clara carried herself. There was no hesitation in her movements, no self-consciousness. She didn't feel the need to fill the silence with awkward chatter like most people did. She simply watched him work, her gaze focused and calculating. When the axle was repaired, she didn't thank him with a flourish or gush over his skills. She simply inspected the job, gave him a nod of approval, and pulled a small pouch from her belt. "Here," she said, holding out a small leather pouch. "Smoked venison. I'll can pay or trade. It's all I have." Garrett's hands instinctively reached for the pouch, but he paused before taking it. "No need for payment," he said, shaking his head. "First repairs on me." Clara raised an eyebrow, clearly not expecting this. She wasn't the kind of person who took favors without returning them. "Fair trade then," she said, her voice firm. Smoked venison or nothing. Garrett could sense the strength in her, that stubborn streak that had kept her going for so long. He didn't press the issue. He accepted the venison. It wasn't much, but it was something. As Clara walked away, Garrett found himself watching her once again. This time, there was no resentment in his heart, no bitterness, just curiosity. She had something about her that he couldn't ignore, something different, something strong, the unspoken challenge. 3 days later, Clara was back. Garrett had expected her to come back. After all, she had only left with a simple exchange. But this time, her visit was different. This time, she wasn't carrying just a broken axle or another repair. This time, she came with a challenge. Clara stood at the edge of the fence, the same determined look in her eyes. Garrett had seen it before, her quiet confidence, the kind of strength that came from surviving hardships, from living on her own. And yet, there was something else in her eyes today, something that told him she was ready for something more. "Garrett," she said, her voice steady and calm. "I came to clarify my offer." He walked toward her slowly, wondering what she meant, but he didn't ask. Clara didn't waste words. Instead, she unfolded a piece of paper she had brought with her. "We marry," she said simply, her eyes meeting his without hesitation. "It's practical. You get protection, and I get stability. You don't have to love me. You don't have to even like me. But we survive together. That's the deal." Garrett stared at the paper she handed him, unsure of what to say. He had never been good at this. He wasn't the kind of man who could just marry someone for survival. But as he looked at her, this woman who had come into his life without asking for anything more than a fair trade, he realized something. Maybe that was all he needed, a chance to survive, to move on from the past, even if it was just for a while. He took a deep breath. "I don't know," he said quietly, almost to himself. "But I'll think about it." Clara nodded, folding the paper back up. "I'm not asking for anything more than what I need," she said. "We'll survive. Together." She turned and walked away, leaving Garrett standing in silence. For the first time in 3 years, he felt a flicker of something, a flicker of hope, maybe. He didn't know if he was ready for love, but maybe he was ready for something else, for survival, for a chance to move on, for a reason to live again. The proposal, 3 days, passed before Clara returned. This time, she didn't bring just an idea. She brought a real proposal, written on paper. It was clear, direct, and to the point. There were no expectations of love or affection, just a simple contract between two people who needed each other to survive. "I came to make it official," Clara said quietly when Garrett opened the door. She handed him the paper, her voice steady as she spoke. "We marry. We both need something. I need protection, a name to keep creditors away, and a roof over my head. You need help, someone to care for the house, to share the burden of living. There's no love involved, no expectations, just survival." Garrett stared at the paper in his hands, turning it over, his mind racing. He had never imagined this, never thought he would marry again, not after Emily. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that Clara's proposal wasn't about love. It was about partnership. It was about survival. He looked up at her, his voice a little hoarse. "I'll do it. I'll sign it." Clara's expression softened, just for a moment. It wasn't a smile, but it was something close to it. She wasn't asking for anything from him, and for the first time in years, Garrett felt like he could give something. The unspoken connection. The winter storm came with little warning, as it always did in the harsh, unforgiving land of the Old West. By the time it arrived, the snow had begun to fall in thick sheets, covering the ranch in a blanket of white. The winds howled like wolves, rattling the windows and shaking the walls of the cabin. It was the kind of storm that made even the hardiest of ranchers think twice. The kind of storm that reminded you just how small and fragile a person could be when the earth and the sky decided to show their power. Garrett and Clara had already begun to settle into their new routine. It wasn't much, not yet, but there was a quiet understanding between them. They weren't a couple in the traditional sense, and they never pretended to be. But as the storm raged outside, something shifted between them. It wasn't love, not yet, but there was a bond forming, a partnership of necessity built on mutual respect. The work had already been hard, mending fences, gathering firewood, tending to the animals, but now, with the storm bearing down on them, there was no choice but to work together. The cold crept into every corner of the cabin, and even though the fire in the hearth was roaring, it seemed as though the chill would never leave. Clara didn't complain. She didn't need to. She had been through worse, Garrett could tell. Her hands, rough and calloused, had seen their fair share of hard labor. She didn't expect anyone to make her life easier. She just worked, alongside him, silently but steadily. Her presence was a comfort, though neither of them spoke much of it. It wasn't about words, it was about the way they moved through the day, together, without conflict, without hesitation. They worked in silence, each of them tending to their tasks, but there was a quiet understanding between them that couldn't be ignored. It wasn't a grand connection, not yet, but in the long hours of the storm, when the world outside was nothing but snow and wind, something in Garrett shifted. The grief he had carried so long was still there, lingering like a shadow, but it wasn't as suffocating as it had been. He was starting to breathe again, to live again, even if he couldn't fully understand what that meant. In the evenings, after the chores were done, they sat by the fire. Sometimes Clara read aloud from the books she had brought with her, and sometimes Garrett would work on his leather, mending a saddle or a pair of boots. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was familiar. It was the kind of silence Garrett had come to know after Emily's death, the kind of silence that wasn't filled with the noise of grief or the pain of loss, but with the quiet acceptance of shared space. The storm raged on for days, and the world outside seemed to disappear beneath a thick blanket of snow. The two of them were stuck inside together, with only the warmth of the fire and the quiet rhythm of their shared existence to keep them company. Garrett found himself looking at Clara in a way he hadn't before, not with longing, not with grief, but with a strange kind of peace. She wasn't trying to replace his wife. She wasn't asking for his heart. She was simply there, present and steady, like the land itself. In the silence of the cabin, Garrett began to realize something. Clara had given him something he hadn't even known he needed, something simple, something real. A companion, not for love, but for survival. And that was enough. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he could face the future, not alone, but with someone by his side, facing judgment and acceptance. The storm eventually passed, leaving behind a world that was blanketed in white. The roads were still impassable, the cold still bitter, but the worst of it had passed. And with the storm's passing came another reality. The town's whispers had not stopped. They had only grown louder. In the weeks that followed, Garrett and Clara faced the judgment of the town. It wasn't as if anyone had expected them to fall in love, but there was an unspoken expectation that they would be just like everyone else, a man and a woman, bound by something other than necessity. But for Clara and Garrett, their bond was different. It wasn't love, but it was something. And something, Garrett had learned, was better than nothing. It wasn't just the women of the town who judged them. The men looked at Garrett with narrowed eyes, as if daring him to prove that he hadn't made some kind of mistake. But Garrett didn't care. He wasn't the man he had been when Emily was alive. He wasn't the man who had hidden in grief, afraid to live. He was moving forward, slowly but surely, and Clara was helping him do it. The turning point came one Sunday, when they attended church for the first time since their marriage. The cold, stone building seemed even colder inside, the air thick with judgment. As they entered, every eye in the room turned to them. The whispers began almost immediately, low, almost imperceptible, but still sharp enough to feel. Mrs. Henderson was there, of course, her eyes flashing with barely concealed contempt. As they took their seats, Garrett could feel the weight of the stares on them. It wasn't just the women who turned their backs, it was the men too. The judgment was thick in the air, as if the entire town had already decided what they thought of them. But it wasn't just the stares that bothered Garrett. It was the way Clara stiffened beside him. He could feel the tension in her shoulders, the way she tried to keep her face expressionless, as if she was trying to pretend the judgment didn't bother her. But it did. It was clear in the way she sat a little straighter, in the way her eyes darted around the room, her face pale but determined. And then, when the service was over, it came. Mrs. Henderson, stepping in front of them as they tried to leave, her voice dripping with disdain. "A convenient marriage, wasn't it, Mrs. Henderson sneered. "How nice, finding a man so desperate." Clara's mouth opened, but Garrett stepped forward before she could speak. His voice was low, but it carried with a strength he hadn't known he had. "She's my wife," he said, his voice steady and unyielding. "My choice. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me." The crowd went silent. Even Mrs. Henderson's mouth hung open, her words caught in her throat. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke, but Garrett didn't back down. He wasn't the broken man they had seen before. He had healed, maybe not fully, but enough to stand tall, to face the world and say that he had chosen this. He had chosen Clara, and he wasn't ashamed of it. The silence that followed was deafening, but it was also liberating. He had finally spoken up, not just for Clara, but for himself. He wasn't going to let the town dictate his choices anymore. He wasn't going to let anyone make him feel less than human. He had moved on from his grief, and if the town didn't like it, then that was their problem, not his. As they left the church, Clara's hand found his. She didn't say anything, but the way her fingers wrapped around his was enough. He had defended her, he had defended them, and that, for the first time, felt right. Moving forward together. It was a few days later when Garrett found himself standing at the foot of Emily's grave, the weight of his grief pressing on him once again. The town had made their judgment, but Garrett had stood up to them. For the first time, he didn't feel like a broken man, but there was still something left to do. There was still the need to reconcile with the past. He knelt beside the cross, his fingers tracing the familiar engraving of her name. "I'm sorry it took me so long," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "But I've found someone who needs me, someone I need." He stood up slowly, wiping his eyes. Clara was waiting for him by the fence. She hadn't said much since the church service, but Garrett knew she had felt the same weight he had. She had carried her own burdens, her own regrets, and yet she was still here, with him, and together they had found something new. As he walked back toward the cabin, Clara met him halfway. She didn't say a word, but when he took her hand, he felt a sense of peace settle in his chest. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but it was theirs to walk together. The future wasn't clear, but for the first time in years, Garrett felt ready to face it.